Okay, so surely we all know the drill by now. One time I made a video about a game I liked. It was called Road to Adventure and just so happened to be part of the Choro series. From there, thanks to some comments from people, my curiosity grew. I made another one. It was called Gadget Racers. And now here I am once again talking about an obscure Japanese car racing game called simply this time Choro. Nothing fancy to it, just as it says. Before we get knee deep into this, I think we owe it to ourselves to learn a bit more about the origin of this unique series of games, so let's have ourselves a bit of a history lesson. Choro are a series of children's toy cars that date back to the 70s, which hail from Japan. They're very colourful, small and chunky with a sort of deformed look, and you've no doubt played with a similar toy at some point in your life. You pull the car back and it has a little coil spring motor inside. That will make the car zoom forward after being let go. They came in a variety of styles and designs as demonstrated by Choro video games with their abundance of Choro bodies. These bodies would obviously have real world inspirations from actual vehicles. The designs are actually by a man called Yasuhiro Nakamura, the same man being the artist responsible for the Japanese box art of the video games as well as books. And we should all give a big thank you to Mr. Nakamura since as far as I can tell, Choro came about because of him and his designs. Now before we talk about any more of those toys, let's take a look at that name, Choro. When I first heard it, I thought it was a bit odd. I mean, I went into reviewing Road to Adventure thinking it was a standalone entity, and in that game, you pick up what are called Choro coins. So that was my first exposure to the phrase Choro. As a word, it's like nothing I've seen before, just a word that makes no sense, followed by a random letter, Choro. After a bit of digging, it turns out the word Choro comes from the Japanese word Choro, which means dash around or run around. And the Q is just an abbreviation of the word cute, so the name is Dash Around Cute or something. Honestly, it's kind of up to interpretation since Japanese as a language uses a lot of onomatopoeias for words. To make things a bit easier though, these toys are also known by another name. Penny Racers, and oh ho ho ho! Yes, I have more games. Another time though. I heard the name Penny Racers and it made me think of really small toy cars that you could compare to the size of a penny. But as it turns out, I was wrong. Choro as a name probably wouldn't have made much sense to Western consumers, so the name Penny Racers came about to make them a lot more marketable to English demographics. Because I guess subtlety isn't our strong suit. The name Penny Racers was chosen due to a distinct design feature of the toys, which was a little coin slot in the back of the car. So you take a humble little penny and put it in the slot in the back of the car, pull the car back and then let it go, and then as it shoots off, it'll sort of pop a wheelie as it goes because, you know, cars do that. Supposedly, they were one of those fad toys that took the world by storm, much like Pogs or Yo-Yos, which suddenly got popular. Choro were such popular toys that they even gained brand licensing from certain anime such as Lupin III, and in the late 80s, Choro were marketed under the Tonka branding as Tonka Turbo Tricksters, which if you don't know was a pretty big deal as back in the day Tonka toys had some serious brand recognition, and one look at the designs confirms they are definitely Choro with their deformed chunky style. However, not all Choro are created equal, as the Western markets and Japanese markets had very different target demographics in mind. Western releases wanted to get the toys in the hands of kids. They were made somewhat cheaply with quite ugly colour choices, with commercials showing off the penny features of the toys, which at the time was a very unique draw, whereas Japanese releases were made with adult collectors in mind, and as such the Japanese versions of the toys were made to much higher standards with superior colour palettes and materials. This explains the Japanese collector magazines, since in Japan, Choro is definitely much more of an adult hobby. There were however a few unusual Choro models made as well as the real world vehicles such as cars, motorbikes, trucks, buses and a lot of Japanese public transport. You'd sometimes get things which didn't look anything like cars at all. Remember that damn duck from Gadget Racers? Yep, he's one of those special Choro. There's also one modelled after Mount Fuji, so there's that. So now that we have a firm grasp on just what exactly Choro was before any of the games came to be, we can move on to why we're here today. To talk about Choro. The PlayStation 2 game, that is. Yeah. It's not just me who sees this, right? I mean, like, the disc art's fine. It's very Choro, very race themed, but what's with this slice at the top? Like, the logo's just been cut in half. Surely they can't all be like this. Huh. Man, what is this? I thought Sonic was supposed to use like guns and stuff. Oh. Let's see. A response. Thank you, Cluckmeister. Okay, so it's not just my disc. Good to know this is how it's supposed to look. I mean, for a moment there I thought it was a defect. You know, hearing the splash screen at the start of these Chorky games has become a strangely comforting entity since I really adore these games even with all of their flaws. Thank you, Takara. Much like previous Chorky games, this one starts up when you're asked a few questions. I think they're just some silly fun because they don't really have much of an impact on things overall. Things like, are you a boy or a girl? What month is your birthday in? What kind of keychain would you like? You also get to choose which colour of garage you have. This just works like picking a file in a game like Super Mario Galaxy or something, and you can actually see the other garages in Bracky Town when you start the game up. It sort of reminds me of Animal Crossing, how in that game you get multiple beds for a house in one town, and the players can interact with each other in some ways. You can actually do the same in Choro, send other players money and stuff. Pretty interesting novelty. Not sure how used a feature like this would go in most households, but I love the idea. You also get to choose the car body you start the game with, which is neat because I'm pretty sure that was entirely random in the past games. There is, however, one question the game doesn't ask you this time. You can't determine the name of the currency. Yep, it is simply called G. What this means is that unlike in the past, we can't have an economy driven solely on the trade of cats, and trust me, this disappointed me greatly. Instead, we're going hardcore RPG with the currency. Good old gold coins, but before I get too far into this game's details, let's do a bit of compare and contrast and look at the very first thing you see in the previous two games right at the start. Now compare those to Choro's beginning. Much different from Road to Adventure and Gadget Racers, which throws you right into the game so fast you almost get whiplash. And while we're comparing this series of games, I've never addressed the strange naming conventions of these Choro titles. Road to Adventure, Gadget Racers, then Choro. It's all over the place. An average player wouldn't even realise these games are even connected in any way, let alone being direct sequels. The titles are just so random, even though they're technically part of the same series. In Japan, things make a bit more sense though. These game titles are called Choro HG, which stands for High Grade, and they are titled as follows: Choro HG2, Choro HG3, and Choro HG4. Now I know what you're thinking, where's Choro HG1? Next time. But for now, let's focus on Choro as we call it over here. Now, I won't go into full detail about the story, but I will give a brief rundown of some of the events which take place in the game. It opens with a race car driver called Norihike driving in a race when suddenly one of the racers spirals out of control, smacking into a wall and dying. Yeah, he dies. This game doesn't mess around. But it turns out it's all a bad dream Norihike was having. Okay, so maybe it messes around a little bit. Then from there, they say a lot of stuff like, be a racer, prove your worth, you know, all that crap. It's not super important because progressing in this game is a nightmare, but I'll get to that. One thing I won't glance over though, is Norihike sleeping in a bed. I just adore how silly this image looks, but how serious the tone of the opening was. A car using a bed. What's next? A sofa? Wait, I made that joke already. From there you meet a character named Barat, who is a quote-unquote friend to your player character, and he's kind of a dick, honestly. He's really cocky and flat out says he thinks you're a crap racer. Well, being very passive aggressive and in some cases a flat out douchebag is very in character for the writing in these games. Something I do like about Barat though is that you'll see him throughout some races since you're both essentially following the same career path, and he'll give some commentary when you pass him with quite a neat looking little animation of him, as if you're communicating by codec or something. And even with the new studio, the classic grrr you often see characters say in these Choro games remains present. Something you may have noticed is just how different this game looks compared to Road to Adventure and Gadget Racers. The overworld looks totally different and things control differently as well. Not to mention the cars look much nicer in my opinion. In Road Trip and Gadget Racers, the cars had a very simple look with solid colours and minimal detail. Yet here the textures are much more detailed, and you can even purchase custom decals for your car body, making things look much more sporty. Besides the modelling, the way you enter buildings and talk to people is presented differently, being proper 3D this time instead of that isometric look the game had previously. Your car also talks, and everything overall has a very different style to it. It puts on those cinema lines that make everything look really fancy and cinematic. Freezax is my daddy. It makes such a simple and harmless conversation far more serious in tone than it needs to be. Now there is actually a reason for all these changes to the game's graphics and presentation, and while I appreciate their attempt to mix things up in this fashion, I actually much prefer the look of the old interiors. They were sort of goofy looking with the odd props scattered around the house and the almost isometric look things had, but those scenes had a much stronger charm to them and presented a nice contrast from your usual driving / racing parts of the game. The new style feels like it's maybe trying a bit too hard. It's that age-old saying, less is more. But this is where things get interesting. Why do you think things are so drastically different from the past two games? It may come as a surprise, but not all Choro games were made by the same studio. Takara gave the Choro franchise to a bunch of different studios over its time, but for the most part they were handled by two studios, E-Game and Barnhouse Effect. Takara jumped around with developers a bit, and this largely depended on the platform they were wanting to develop for. E-Game and Barnhouse Effect are the most notable teams to work on the franchise, with their work being mostly on the HG series on PlayStation 2. I can't seem to find much information on E-Game except this webpage, which doesn't really tell me much, but I can tell you that Barnhouse Effect is still making games in various places. No new Choro unfortunately, but they do have one game which is very similar in the Japanese Wii U eShop called The Great Race. Choro as a game is very indicative of Barnhouse Effect's style. Cars have much more detail than E-Game, with much more work being put into texture details, and as I mentioned before, cars can have custom drawn decals which you can buy for extra cash in the store. Some of the Choro bodies are very nicely detailed with artwork and some nicely detailed modelling work. I think overall I prefer the look of this game in terms of its cars, but I don't much care for the overworld of the game. Gone are the Sonic Adventure style adventure fields of Gadget Racers or the vast yet empty open world of Road to Adventure. Instead we have three towns of Braki, Poki and Nyaki, which all look very similar and have the same lower poly top down look and even use many of the same modelling assets but simply moved around, and upon closer inspection of the town segments of the game, they work completely differently to the normal racing gameplay, which is a first. Although you do get the occasional minigame which lets you drive around the town like usual. I'll get to those though. These towns all come with a map which details all the locations you can visit, and I have a very simple issue with this map system. The towns are surprisingly difficult to navigate because the minimap is just so small and fuzzy, and when you bring up this large map it doesn't help all that much, but would be super useful with one additional feature. It's really that simple. If they had added an arrow to this map to help you get your bearings, it would have helped make navigating these places much more painless. The map is still handy when used in conjunction with the minimap. If you squint your eyes hard enough to figure out where your green arrow is, you can see all available locations in the town. I mean, just look at them all. So many buildings to enter and places to explore. Surprise! They're mostly pointless. Seriously, so many times you'll enter a building, be given some strange blurb from a character, and then be told to leave even in cases where it feels like the game wants you to enter this building, when it makes the most logical sense for progressing the story. You just walk in and they, in a roundabout way, tell you to hit the road. You get a letter saying, "We need help around the farm, come see me." You go to the farm, he doesn't mention anything regarding the letter and instead just tells you to beat it, breaking all logic. So for the longest time I had very little idea as to how to go about progressing the plot of this game. There are just so many occasions where a character will tell you to go check this place out or talk to this person and it doesn't work. The funniest example I experienced would be this. In Choro there's a sort of day and night cycle. It's pretty arbitrary and isn't used as well as it could be, and the days are split into morning, afternoon, evening and night. Time changes whenever you enter and then exit a building, so I found this coffee shop at night time and then got told, "We are closed, come back during the day." So I waited around until daytime arrived and then went back in to be told, "Oh, you aren't a noble, we only serve nobles, please leave." Like, why don't you tell me, "Hey, it's night, we're closed, but don't bother coming back anyway because you're a basic fucking plebeian." Only Choro, huh? Luckily with games like this, the plot isn't all that important, and to be honest, it's not even why I play these games in the first place, so let's get down to the nitty gritty. What kind of fun is there to be had in Choro? Choro, with all of the changes it brings to the table, with its fresh graphical style and coming from a different developer, is still at its core a car PG. Hence, while there's still a lot of plot to be discovered, but outside of exploring the three towns, you can of course race. You do this from your garage. In fact, most things you access via your garage this time around. If you recall, in Gadget Racers, it sort of took inspiration from Diddy Kong Racing on the N64, with getting into races that is. You drive around areas of the world until you stumbled upon gates which accessed races of various difficulties. Choro instead goes about this in a much more simple but boring way. Everything is accessed via the menus in the garage. You choose race and then get to pick from 5 islands which all have a few different races and tracks to choose from. Using the same terminology from past games, with tracks being either S, M or L, meaning small, medium and large in terms of their length, and not unlike its predecessors, Choro is all about dem upgrades, and just like before, it requires you to grind. Yeah, they still didn't fix that one issue, so find a track you're comfortable with and have the speed placed reasonably, and then play it 100 times over to accumulate the cash to get some sweet upgrades. That's Choro for you. It's such a weird issue to have, but so many of the tracks are just way too difficult right at the start, and the only sensible way to get cash is to just grind a hell of a lot in the first track. Since other tracks will either have racers which are far too fast, terrain which needs specific tyres, or some other random criteria that you're not well equipped for. It's not all bad though. Choro's racing overall feels way better than previous titles. It just feels tighter overall and has a few extra mechanics in place to help make things a bit less awkward. For one, they dealt with the whole floaty physics issue from before, so no more hitting a tiny bump and floating for a full 10 seconds. I mean, remember this? Although, in its place, this game has its own set of weirdness which becomes a lot more prominent in later tracks. Instead of floating awkwardly, you roll and flip around and fall all over the place. There are some tracks which, due simply to the way they're designed, cause you to flip and spin more than others. Planet Jump M, for instance, has low gravity, and a bunch of little bumps on the road you have to navigate, not to mention a bunch of UFOs that literally try to shoot you off the road. This track is just madness. I mean, it's tricky on its own due to the low gravity, and even with the right type of tyres you can still just barely get a good traction. And with the low gravity, the bumps on the ground, as well as being knocked around by other racers, it just makes this level insane. My recommendation? Buy a heavy car chassis and knock those a-holes into space. The other level I experienced ridiculous bumping and flipping on is this Chinese themed level with Japanese music. Oh, Choro, you do you. Part of this track has a set of stairs you climb like a ramp, and when you reach the top, you almost always end up doing some kind of barrel roll or flip, and even occasionally phase through the roof after the jump. This would be harmless and funny if it didn't sometimes cause you to end up facing the wrong direction, slowing you down, leading you to potentially being overtaken. Emphasis on sometimes though, as this has only happened a couple of times. Most of the time you do end up facing the correct way. The same happens with one of the other new mechanics in the game, spinning out, which, to put simply, is a consequence of drifting a bit too hard. When driving around a narrow corner, or even simply having too much speed when driving on a curve, you'll hear your car tires start to screech, indicating that you have too much oversteer, and if you don't correct it by slowing down a bit or straightening up, you'll spin out of control for a few seconds. This slows you down greatly and potentially throws you off the track onto the dirt. I actually like the inclusion of the spinning out mechanic, since it means you have to put a bit more thought into how you're driving. It sort of reminds me of F-Zero X and its handling, since in that game, if you turn a bit too hard, you'll lose traction and end up facing a completely wrong direction, which again requires you to think a lot more about your turning, encouraging you to use the brakes and maintain a sensible speed on turns, and go all out in straights, which goes the exact same for Choro. There's so much more complexity to the driving, and it all comes from various parts you can change in your vehicle. The performance of your car comes down to these key factors: chassis, engine, brakes, steering, wheels and transmission. Chassis is just the underparts of your car, the frame so to speak, and in this game it serves a simple purpose of giving your car more weight and better endurance against enemy racers. And this ties into another new mechanic which I'll get into in just a bit. The next key part of your car is the engine. Your engine for the most part is all about acceleration, helping you to reach those top speeds much faster than everyone else, as demonstrated by comparing the first race at the beginning to later when you have a much better engine. The difference is obvious as you just tear out in front of everyone. Brakes are simply as you'd expect. They help you to slow down easier, which is far more important this time around, what with the new racing mechanics. Steering is simple in that it literally just dictates how quickly you can turn your car, which can have a large impact on the feel of driving, since your new turning speed can take some getting used to. The same goes for your engines. You need to get a feel for the driving, and whenever you get a new engine that goes so much faster, or something that drastically changes your vehicle's performance, you need to relearn the limits of your car and how you should be driving. Wheels are once again a surprisingly important part of your vehicle. You get a few types just like before: racing tyres, off-road tyres, and even tyres which try to do both. They contribute by giving you much more grip, which helps you to turn sharper and can help you to not spin out. Lastly, we have transmission, which is your car's gearbox. The way upgrading this works is you buy new gears, and the more gears your car has, generally the faster you can go. But you need a fast enough engine to give you enough acceleration to actually achieve the higher gears. There are two types of transmissions called AT and MT, which stands for automatic transmission and manual transmission. The differences in these should be quite obvious. Automatic transmission means it does it, well, automatically. Changing gears is done without any input from the player and you don't need to think about it. Manual transmission requires player input to shift up and down through the gears, which you do with L2 and R2. Now, while manual might sound like more work, it comes with a few benefits which led to manual being my transmission of choice. Manual transmission can actually achieve greater speeds than automatic, and I like it more because you have more control over your speed overall. Shifting up and down a gear gives you agency over your acceleration rate. The lower the gear, the faster you accelerate, but obviously that gear's speed caps out, which means you need to shift up. It means that you can time your gear shifts to gain as much acceleration as possible, as well as use it to aid in slowing down in certain situations. All of these changes to your vehicle's parts add a level of nuance I never really felt with Road to Adventure or Gadget Racers, at least not to the same degree. So on those odd occasions when people don't tell you to just get out of their house or that they're a garbage truck, you get given special tasks to take part in, and they're surprisingly varied. Go down into a sewer system to find the lost workers and guide them out, race within one of the towns against a ragtag gang of girls called the Tough Chicks, take part in a race alongside a cliffside road and don't fall off or you die, or race toy cars on an electric track. You ever play with one of those Skelectric sets or something similar? Yeah, it's basically that with bloody suicidal computer controlled characters. Not all events are races or minigames though. There's one where a guy says he's going to talk to you about religion and prayer for exactly 3 minutes and then basically guilt trips you for being impatient and wanting to get on with playing the game. Pro tip, don't accidentally talk to this guy again. You'll hate yourself for it. There's even a weird moment where you go to a monument that's all about racing and get spoken to by a literal god named Korshal, the god of racing, who proceeds to talk to you about destiny, racing, courage, and then he gives you a CD. Gee, thanks god. As you can tell, Choro is an interesting and bizarre RPG style racing game that, even with being handled by a different developer from the ones we've come to know and love, still manages to maintain that Choro charm we all adore. From the passive aggressive characters, the hilarious translations and generally awkward dialogue, to the car bodies and genuinely fun racing full of grinding, upgrades and customization, with plenty of methods of progression through not only the story but the Grand Prix and various racing types. I have to say, Choro really surprised me. It had dialogue moments that literally made me laugh with how silly and unexpected they were. It's goofy, weird, but wears it all with pride, and if you're a fan of these types of games, then I would definitely say Choro is a game for you. I started reviewing Choro games essentially by accident, and it's kind of turned into a bit of an obsession at this point. I have so much up my sleeves in terms of future Choro content, so if you like this stuff, then maybe stick around. Or don't, see if I care. Grrr! Ah! Hey, and thanks for watching. I have a couple of other videos in Choro games already on the channel, so feel free to check those out as well as subscribe. And if you're feeling generous, why not support me on Patreon? That's all for now, until next time.